Hello everyone, my name is Maya, and this presentation is about vampire defense techniques and how and why they've changed throughout history. To first understand why we use the weapons that we do, we need to understand what a vampire is. It is a fictional, blood-drinking supernatural figure that has existed for centuries, but their characteristics change depending on the time, place, and fear amongst society. They usually embody fears about mortality, disease, desire, and outsiders. This presentation will explore how the tools used to fight vampires reveal more about human values, fear, and identity than the vampires themselves. One example of how society's fears is reflected onto vampires' characteristics is Count Orlok. He is actually the first cinematic vampire to ever exist, and I have pointed arrows at a few of his physical features that represent those fears among society. So, as you can see, he has very pointy, long fingers and sharp razor like teeth. These are qualities that resemble a rat, which rats are known to cause and spread illnesses and diseases. So, this directly reflects society's fear about pandemics, epidemics, illnesses during the time that his character was created. He also has sunken-in eyes, which is also a sign of decay and illness. And he has pointed ears, a sign that he's just different. There's something off about him, like this would be a reflection of society's fear of foreign threats or the unknown. A few examples of vampire warding and killing techniques will be sealing entryways, staking bodies, burning corpses, and there's so many more. My thesis is that methods used to ward off, kill, or prevent the transformation into vampirism reflect changing religious, cultural, and societal anxieties. These techniques are symbols of the human need to confront and control what we fear: impurity, outsiders, and disorder. One example of how people would prevent the transition is in The Kith and Kin, written by Montague Summers. He writes that during the 17th to the 20th century, the Bantu African tribe believed that when a living person shed blood, they would have to cover it thoroughly, or else this could wake a corpse from the dead. Why? This is because blood to them represented life, and leaving it exposed risked disturbing the boundary between the living and the dead. Unattended blood could essentially attract supernatural spirits, signaling that the soul was spiritually leaking or vulnerable, unprotected, that it was an easy target. So, this was a protective act to close that portal between the realms. This practice directly reflects a cultural fear of spiritual imbalance, where vampirism arises not just from physical death, but from being introduced to a material that represents life, essentially like inviting them to the living realm. So, one way that people would outsmart vampires was with seeds, particularly poppy seeds. This was done in Slavic traditions during the 18th to 19th century. Vampires were believed to be compelled to compulsively count. This is called arithmomania, and this means that they would be forced to tally each seed, lasting until sunrise when they would have to go seek darkness. Entryways were also seen as spiritual thresholds, a portal from the spiritual realm to the living realm. This technique directly reflects the fear of disorder that the undead brings. It not only brings death, but also madness, obsession, and an unnatural defiance of spiritual law. Why would they use seeds? Seeds were easy to access, harvest, they were affordable, but they also symbolize fertility, order, and life, which are the exact opposite characteristics that vampires carry. Why would the vampires have to go seek darkness? This is because sunlight was believed to have purification powers that would burn vampires, so they could not be out in the sun. And then here's another quote from Montague Summers, just explaining that the vampire would have to go seek darkness because he would not be able to count all of the seeds before the sun rose. Killing vampires with cremation. This was done in Slavic and Christian regions during the 17th to the 19th century. They saw cremation as the most thorough and sacred form of purification. Fire was seen as a spiritual cleanser, and it was associated with the Holy Spirit. It destroyed not only the body, but it also severed the connection between the vampire and the living realm, and completely destroying whatever force was possessing the body. A vampire was not just considered a monster, but a soul in rebellion against God, so therefore the fire symbolized spiritual justice and restoring moral order. Another quote from Montague Summers, he mentions that cremation wasn't only used to destroy vampires, but it was also used to completely avoid the transition. They would cremate deceased human bodies so that there would be no vessel available to be possessed. So, how has technological advancements changed vampire weapons? Vampire killing methods have evolved into modern concepts and has evolved along with our technology. So, one example of this would be UV lights. UV lights mimic the sun's radiation by emitting energy in wavelengths that are between 320 to 400 nanometers. This would be a way to defeat or reveal vampires because it would burn them. This would work because this actually builds on the Christian symbolism that light represents truth, purity, and divine power. Just as sunlight destroyed evil, UV light becomes a modern replacement, offering a technological form to the same spiritual cleansing and purifying force, but you could hold it in the palm of your hands. Why wouldn't a regular light work? This is because regular lights or lamps emit visible light and sometimes heat, but they do not emit UV rays. The UV rays in the sun is actually what causes human skin to burn, so we applied that same logic to vampires. So, how have medical advancements changed modern day vampire fighting weapons? They introduced new ways to control vampirism using science rather than spirituality. The vampire throughout time is more portrayed as an infected human rather than a supernatural evil being, and now it is seen that science can maybe regulate these infected beings. So, how could we use medicine to treat a vampire? This is one example. This is in the movie Blade 2, where the main character is a half vampire hybrid, and he injects himself every day with a serum to suppress his bloodlust. This is pretty much like acts like a medication to a chronic disease as it suppresses the side effects, but it is not a cure in itself. And then here's an example of in this movie this scene where he is injecting himself with that. I think it's important to know that you can see right here how much pain he's in doing this serum, but this kind of shows how vampires have developed more empathy in cinematic than they did like in the first cinematic vampires, how they were just purely evil. And I mean, obviously he is in a lot of pain, and he's doing this for the good of the people around him, and he still is holding on to his moral values. So the conclusion for this presentation is that throughout history, vampire myths have been used to represent the boundary between us and them, what we fear the most. Disease, spiritual impurity, foreignness, it's all projected onto the vampire figure. The tools for the vampires to kill them reveals a fear of outsiders, a desire for moral and bodily purity, and a need to destroy what defies social norms or sacred laws. These weapons are cultural artifacts because they show how much society has changed during time. It just represents society's deep fears, not just of physical threats, but of spiritual chaos, foreign invasion, and existential uncertainty. Whether it's fire, seeds, or black lights, the way we kill vampires actually tells us more about ourselves and our fears rather than the vampires themselves.